All right. Are we live? Can you guys hear me, see me? Is all that stuff working on that end? Just let me know in the chat. And if you guys can't see me or hear me, yep, we're cool. Perfect. All right. So tonight we're obviously going over period 5, 1750 to 1900. Just to get started, can you guys let me know scale of like 1 to 5 how you feel about period 5 and all the material in it generally? Just drop a number in the chat and stuff like that. Free period 3, 4. Okay, so pretty easy 10 out of 10. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of just like general, okay, -1,000, it's not great. 3.5, all right, so generally middle of the road, like you could tell the concepts, but you can't exactly analyze them and do stuff like that. That's definitely a good spot to be for here. Just to kind of go over what we're going over tonight, we're going over period 5, which is 4 key concepts. It's technically the most key concepts for any unit, and then we'll be talking about answering questions and talking about the exam and stuff like that. So here, I'll pull up my slides here. We can jump right into it. There we go. All right, so these are the slides. If you guys click the little slides and resources button, you can actually look at the slides yourself, so you can follow along with me and all that stuff. But I'll be presenting on my screen here. So let's get started. All right, so here's just I feel like I've been shoving this down your throat, but here's the 5-able social media and stuff. So Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, shameless plugs. And also for the chat, you guys are free to, talk and do whatever in there. I can see what you say, but, it's all yours, free zone. All right. Thanks, Jillian. All right. So, countdown. There are 55 days until the AP World exam. A little bit of a shake, especially for people who have other AP tests earlier in the year, earlier in the weeks. Countdown or kowtow. 55 days, but that's actually a good amount of time, especially if you're on period like end of 5, period 6. You're good. Like you're fine. You're gonna finish the material quick, and then you gotta use at least a month to study. You'll be fine. All right. So let's jump right into this. So key concept 5.1 focuses primarily on industrialization and the development of a global capitalist system. And so the Industrial Revolution really starts in 1750 and in the mid to late 1700s in Great Britain. And it's important to understand the main reasons why Great Britain experienced this first. The main reasons why Great Britain was able to experience industrialization first instead of any other countries is primarily they had high amounts of coal and other natural resources like timber. They had population growth, which was really important for human capital, which, especially if you're an AP macro, you understand is a really important part to economic growth and economic, safety. Am I frozen? Am I frozen? Just let me know if no, okay. That's weird. All right. Also, Britain sponsored property rights in the free market. And so this really helped people to have their own capital and have their own industrial, mills and stuff like that. Also, rivers and canals. This allows people to build, things like mills, factories, and stuff like that. Because originally, you think of a factory now, you think of the stereotypical thing like shooting out steam off the tops and stuff like that, and smoke pillowing out. Originally it was actually all water powered because we were using steam engines. And so what happened was you needed to situate your factories and mills on coastlines, because if you didn't have water, or running water specifically, you weren't able to run your mill. You didn't have the power. It's like having a factory today, but with no electricity. I will gladly host meme review if you get PewDiePie to approve. All right. You also have a lot of technology advances. So you have the steam engine specifically. This was invented, I don't know the exact year, I can Google it, but it was invented by Watt, which is why we have the Watt as a power unit. And it used coal, which is a really important part of the Industrial Revolution. It used coal and then converted that to steam and used that to, power things. It's probably going to be around an hour, maybe an hour and a half. They're shorter than 2 hours, I can tell you that much. All right. This leads to also new demands for raw materials and markets, which we'll talk about a lot more in detail when we get to imperialism, which is key concept 5.2. We also see a lot of new economic tools. So we see capitalism, and I'll explain what capitalism real quick is. It's basically where, but not the PowerPoint. You can, Andrew, you can maybe just follow along with the slides. I can let you guys know when to turn the slides if you guys need. All right, so capitalism is basically an economic system. Yeah, Alvaro kind of hit it right on the head. You have private investments in industry. So rather than having, for example, the government having really a big say in the economy, it's a very, very laissez-faire, very, it's a very, kind of hands-off system where you let the market stabilize itself. You have private property is a real thing, a real important thing with capitalism. And this was invented by Adam Smith, and he wrote his America has a mixed economy. So I'll add that as a question, because that's a cool thing to talk about. So his main thesis thing in the Wealth of Nations, which is a really important text that if you're into economics, I really recommend. It's a good read. He was talking about basically how when the economy gets out of whack, if we're in a recession or if inflation's really high, the government actually shouldn't do anything. His idea is that there's an invisible hand, and that's a kind of key mark of capitalism, pure capitalism at least, that the market is self-stabilizing. So that's a really important economic concept in capitalism. And then you also see liberalism, which is invented by Mill. And you also see new economic things such as stock markets really rise. So you have, joint stock companies in period 4. These evolve into real stock markets. So you see, I'm not sure if it's in this period, but you see things like, in the modern day at least, if you want an equivalent, things like the New York Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, stuff like that. And the way the stock market works is really people can buy parts of companies in exchange for, they give them money and they get part of a company essentially. And you also see a gold standard. So basically having money having an equivalent, usage in gold. So $1 is now worth 5 gold coins or whatever, And obviously, industrialization wasn't a silent thing. There were a lot of responses. So first, when you have these new factories rise, you also see the rise of a new class system. And so you see a new working class, a new kind of blue-collar working class working in these factories. And they start to basically get treated really badly by the factory workers called the bourgeoisie. And so they organize unions. And what they do is they essentially, yeah, it was, but in this time period, we'll have a gold standard. So basically, in this time period, we see people in unions. What was I saying? We have people in unions going to these factory owners and saying, if you don't give us better wages, hours, conditions, we're going to quit. And a lot of the times they work, a lot of the times they don't. A specific example, especially if you're an A-push, is the, I believe the Lowell girls, which were in Massachusetts, I want to say. Southern Massachusetts or Connecticut, some northern state. But they go to their owner and they say, if you don't give us better treatment, we're going to leave. And what happened eventually is that they did leave and they brought in immigrants as work. All right. There's also alternative economic visions, and so you see Marxism and anarchism arise. So I know someone asked earlier what anarchism was, but I'll go into Marxism a little bit because that's more important. So Karl Marx in 1848 he publishes the Communist Manifesto, and it basically has to do with class relations. So during this time, you see a real split in class relations because of capitalism. That's a real consequence of it. And so you have, these really rich businessmen, but at the same time, you have these really poor people who are making barely enough to live in factories. And so what Marx says is essentially, we take the rich and we take their wealth and we spread it among everyone else in order to have an equal society rather than having the really rich oppress the really low. And you'll see this, and you'll really see this happen more in the 21st century and 20th century. You'll see this happen a lot in China, Russia, Cuba, a little bit in Latin America. And that's where it really comes into play. Here, it's kind of just mentioned. It only exists really for 52 years before the period ends. But then in 1949, you see it happen in China. 1917, you see it happen in Russia, stuff like that. Yeah, socialism is a really weird topic. I don't really understand it too well myself. You could do some research. It is interesting, but I don't want to really get super into it because it's really political nowadays too. So some countries also resisted industrialization. So we see specifically the Qing dynasty and the Ottoman dynasty, not the Ottoman dynasty, the Ottoman Empire, excuse me. They really they start to resist it a little bit. You see some things like the Young Turks and the self-strengthening movement to really try to get it working, but it really, they kind of resist, and you can see the Ottoman Empire and the Qing dynasty really go downhill during this period, especially because of imperialism and European, domination in the world. And some did industrialize, but they were really late to the game. So you have things like the Meiji Restoration in Japan, which I can explain if you guys want. And then you see Russia, which has state-sponsored imperialism. And that basically, you have Russia borrowing money from European countries in order to build factories. And this really doesn't end well. Obviously, in 1917, we see them fall to a communist system. And in 1905, even they lose the Russo-Japanese War to Japan. And that really shows how Japan really successfully industrialized. So you see this little kind of tiny island nation just destroy this, continent-wide beast of a nation. And that really goes to show how unsuccessfully Russia did it, really industrialized. All right, so here's a little graphic on some causes of industrialization, specifically in Europe. So, we have Europe's location really helps in trade, urbanization, and the growth of cities. Natural things like iron and timber. Then you also see agricultural productivity, which helps to lead to more innovation and more things that really help grow the economy. Furthermore, you see new population growth and colonialism, and they get just stupidly rich off of their colonies. You have not just Spain and South America, we also have, the British Empire starting to grow, the, stuff like that. So those are really the big reasons why we see industrialization happen in Great Britain. Yeah, it happened first in Great Britain. That was the very first place it started. And then it came to America and Germany and all those places. All right, so this is a graph of GDP from the year 1 until the year 2000 something, till the present day, essentially. And you can really see between 1800 and 1900, give or take, you can see GDP of the United States and Western Europe really soars. And then we see, here, I'll add that as a question because I'm able to explain that later. And then we see also the GDP of India and China really dip. And that really goes to show how they were colonized and really kind of weren't doing great during this time period. So we see, we see this happen mainly in 1973. We see some things happening in China and stuff like that. So that's really important to know. Here we have the two founders of the main economic systems of this time period. So on the left, we have Karl Marx in all of his glory. He is the founder of communism, the founder of Marxism, a lot of those really weird terms that we kind of mix together. And he writes the Communist Manifesto, as I mentioned, with another guy, I forget his name, in 1848, and that's published. And then I have no idea if they're wearing wigs. And then you have Adam Smith on the right, who invented capitalism. And so these two economic systems, especially in the 20th century, are going to go head to head throughout history, really. You have capitalism with their private property and their revenue, but their class distinctions, whereas you have communism with their equal playing field. But also there are a lot of issues with communism that, if you read some things and you look into it, there's issues with both systems. And I really want to stress that they're not perfect, either of them. And finally, last thing we're going to talk about is this is a train called the Rocket. Basically, this is one of the very first trains that ever kind of happened, and it really started a new era of transportation for industrialization. And we see, we see trains start happening. This really helps to spur economic growth, and so we see transportation really go up, and we see trade go up too, because we can have trains carry things super quickly, as opposed to having to have someone on a horse go from France to Spain. Now they can go on a train, and these trains really do help kind of follow industrialization as they improve. And we see in the United States, we see the Transcontinental Railroad, we see railroads in the north, and we also see new things like canals. And yeah, trains are really important at this time period. Last year the DBQ was literally about trains. It was an absolute joke. But yeah, the trains are really important. And if there's one piece of industrial technology that you have to know, it's railroads. That's arguably the most important for the Industrial Revolution. Oh yeah, I forgot about this one. So this is a picture of, I forget the name of this photo, but it was taken around this time period in the United States. And it is, the main point of this you should take away is child labor. So essentially what happens with this is when people need new labor, they go to not just, men, they go to children, they go to women. So it does open up the labor market, you could argue. It was cheaper, I believe. Yeah, it was a rough system, and a lot of places really weren't great. And so you can see this girl, she's working in what looks to be a textile mill. Yeah, the patriarchy was still huge, but women started to get into the labor market here instead of having to, move from just live in the house. And really, before the Industrial Revolution, all manufacturing happened in the house. It was called the cottage industry. And you see people on a farm, they get the wool, they bring it to their house, they make the, textile, then they go down, to the market and sell it. And here we have new factories that are owned by a specific corporation or a guy, and now it's sold. And these people are just doing, the manual labor over and over and over. I'm not sure what year it was repealed. It's different for every country, obviously. All right, so before we move on to imperialism, let me just go through some of these questions here. Let me see if there's any here. All right, is America capitalist? This, it's a kind of a weird question. We have what's called a mixed economy. It's basically where we don't have a perfectly free market, but we don't have a completely communist state. And so we have things like, when you think about it, we are capitalist in the sense that, you could go and start your own business, a private, company. But at the same time, we have things like welfare. We have things like, tax redistribution, stuff like that, that is more indicative of a communist, socialist state. I'm not trying to say we're those are socialism, but they're definitely key marks of a socialist state. And then what's GDP? GDP stands for gross domestic product. It is essentially, and I believe the exact definition is, and I should be able to get this in taking AP Macro, it's the dollar value of all new goods and services produced in a country's border in 1 year. So essentially, like all the goods that are produced in a country in 1 year. It's almost like the national income, almost. Not really, but that's kind of as good as I can explain it without going into the economic indicators and stuff like that. All right, so let's start talking about key concepts 5.2, which is imperialism. So, imperialism really, you could argue that it started in the last time period with the Spanish Empire and stuff like that, but you have what's called new imperialism happen during this time period. So we have markets and materials being a main cause. We have these new industrializing European nations, and they now need these raw materials in order to fund their manufactured goods. You need things like rubber, palm oil, diamonds for some things, and other various, cotton, I believe in Egypt. And so they really do go down there, and that's the main reason. They want access to markets and materials. M&Ms is a good way to remember it. You also see some justifications around race and around these things that are really kind of racist and outdated. So things like social Darwinism. So social Darwinism is essentially the process by which people said they took Darwin's theory of evolution, survival of the fittest. Then they said, Europe's doing better than Africa. Therefore, we're more evolved than Africa. And that was their main arguing, that we're more evolved, therefore we're able to take over. And this is similar to the white man's burden, where the white man's burden was essentially them saying that, we are more, we have civilization, we have Christianity, we have these, very European, very civilized aspects. So we, the white men, are going to take it upon ourselves to go to Africa and help to civilize these people with our own, the goodness of our own hearts. And it's kind of funny looking at it back then, but this is really how people, thought about it. So the main ways that people, imperialized, there was diplomacy. So you have, like, for example, in the United States, Native American treaties and the Berlin Conference, which, the Berlin Conference we'll talk about later, but it basically divided, the Berlin Conference of 1884. Basically, I have like a little political comic on this later, but it's basically where all the European countries sit down at a table and go, all right, Britain, you get this part. Germany, you get this part. Belgium, you get this part. There were 0 Africans there. So that's something you really need to know, that it was a white man's thing that they were taking over. But then you also have warfare. So you can see in this time period with new industrialized weapons, things like the Maxim gun, which is a good piece of evidence. That's the first machine gun to ever be invented. And so you see this happen in the Zulu tribe. They really kill a lot. And then you guys were talking about the Belgians in the Congo. And so, what happened was basically the Belgians under Leopold II, they come and they take over the Congo, and they essentially force all the Africans to produce rubber for them. And if they don't reach their rubber quotas, their hands are cut off. Ethiopia is kind of a weird example of where, Europe wasn't able to get Ethiopia. Ethiopia is the one example that stays, they stay independent for at least the most part. I don't know if there was ever any real, try to get it besides from Italy. And they remain independent. They're kind of legends. And then we also see economic imperialism, which is really a kind of understated thing in this time period, but it can be argued that it's even stronger than territorial imperialism, because by taking over a country's economy, you really can take over that whole country in general from the inside out without any political upheaval. So we see things like the Opium Wars, the Monroe Doctrine, and if you guys ask, I can really go in depth into some of these topics. But for now, I'm just going to do a general overview and then go through some political comics and other important things to know. The Monroe Doctrine is basically where President Monroe, 5th President of the United States, says to Europe, right after around the Latin American Wars of Independence, he says, Europe, if you try to come over to Latin America and take over again, we'll consider it an act of aggression and we'll declare war on you. And so it was really kind of little Americas. Remember, this was like 18-something. And you see, little old America go to Europe, this, big giant Europe, and they're kind of their first step onto the world stage. It's pretty cool. The fact that it even paid off, the fact that it even worked, because we did not have the military to fight Europe. America wanted Latin America. So the effects of imperialism, we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth. We see colonies continue. So we see British India, Dutch Indonesia, and they really expand as well. They don't expand, but they intensify. Especially, you can see the example of the British Raj after the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857. You can see the Queen really basically just take over, and now it's Britain. It's not British India, it's Britain with the Raj. It's under complete British rule, and so that's a really good example of colonies expanding in their power and reach to their what's called their imperial metropole. And so we also see states expand. So we see, the American West manifests destiny. Russia expands a bit more. And Meiji Japan becomes a real imperial power. And this is the one kind of non-European imperial power. And it's a little bit weird because after they go through the Meiji Restoration, their primary goal is westernize, westernize, westernize. And a primary part of westernization is, of course, trying to take over the entire world. And so what they do is they try to take over Korea, they try to take over some islands in the South Pacific, and this eventually leads to them becoming a power in World War I and World War II. And so, in World War II, you really see them really become an imperial power. They almost go power crazy. And so you also see states dissolve, so things like Egypt, European and North Africa, the Balkan independence, stuff like that, I'm not too knowledgeable on, but those are some examples. And we also see a lot of settler colonies. So things like South Africa, we see Europeans go there to live, not just to make money. We see America as an example. Then we also see Australia, which is a cool little, tidbit, that they would send their prisoners there. Great Britain, they would send their prisoners, and it would basically become a prisoner state. And so they'd send everyone. If you ever read Great Expectations, that's a good example of where a guy is sent to Australia to do typically something like indentured servitude, and he would basically work there for a sentence and then be sent back to Britain. You also see a loss of native culture. So when the Europeans come in, they didn't really have much tolerance for anything other than pure Christianity. And so what they did was, if you ever read Things Fall Apart, this is a good book for imperialism. You really see the native religions and native things to really start to fall apart during this time period. And so, Okonkwo Nwoye, it's a really good book. If you like imperialism and you like historical fiction, and you're taking AP Lit, book review. And so, we really see native culture get suppressed during this time period because of imperialism. Right. So here's some political comics about imperialism. So on the left, we see, I've always called this like the Chinese pizza, but really what it is it's indicative of the spheres of influence that different countries had. And so we see, we have, here I'll go one by one, we have China up here, then we have Queen Victoria of Great Britain, Germany, Russia, France, and Japan. And we see they're all kind of sitting there negotiating how they split up China, how they're going to, how much is Japan going to get? How much is Britain going to get? How much is Germany going to get? And first of all, you can tell it's really tense around these countries. But also, you can notice China in the background. They don't have a say in this. They're just like saying, "Stop, guys! You need to stop." But nothing's happening. They don't have any sort of say in this. And another kind of cool thing, as you can see, Japan's got a samurai sword, so that's interesting. And then on the right, we see another political comic regarding Great Britain and the British Empire, and it really shows how widespread the British Empire was. You can see they have Canada, Egypt, Jamaica, Australia, South Africa. Really, they have, and I have a map of the British Empire. There was a saying that, if you haven't heard it before, it said, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." And this wasn't just to show power. It was literal. They had so much land at one point that there was never a spot on the earth that it wasn't sunny. Like, it's insane how big the British Empire got. All right, here's a little political comic that really shows the white man's burden idea. So you can see the real big one is Uncle Sam. You have him over here carrying these what are portrayed to be savage Africans, and you can see he's sweating. He's putting all of his work to take them from brutality and slavery up to this golden pillar of civilization. And you can tell both of these guys are white. They look really aristocratic, and they're taking these savages from the other countries up to civilization. And so it's a really interesting, really racist idea that they thought, they kind of justified their own things by saying, we're helping them out, we're bringing them to civilization. When in reality, why did they have civilization more than another place? It was their own power and their own kind of power complex that really took over. Yeah, the British man's kind of fat, but really, I mean, during this time period, being fat was it meant you were rich. Could Sam bench? Probably, yeah. Right. So here's a map of natural resources during this time period. So we can really see that this is, American history is really not that great. It's kind of dark at times, especially in the 1800s. But here we have essentially a map of natural resources for export. So you can see, obviously, the Latin America and the Americas in general are really rich in sugar, meat, palm oil. But then we can also see really India and Africa really has some good resources. They're really well off. And so it's worth kind of mentioning, what happened to Africa that they got taken over. Remember, period 3, Africa was a force to be reckoned with. And so, that's really something to think about, that what happened to Africa that they were able to be taken over and they didn't industrialize. Because if you think, and guano, just in case you don't know, it's bird poop. Guano is bird poop, and it was essentially used as fuel, I believe, for some things. And also, you might think it's kind of funny, but it was such a big export that the United States passed a law called the Guano Act that basically said, if there's an island that's discovered and it has guano on it, it's ours. That's how much it was worth. So it was a really important export. It's really something worth mentioning, like maybe in an LEQ, to a really good piece of specific evidence that if you need to mention a natural resource. All right, so here's a thing with the Berlin Conference. So we can see we have all of these European guys. I don't really know for sure, but I'm thinking this is Otto von Bismarck, maybe, possibly. And we'll talk about him a little bit later. And we can see up here they have a map of Africa, and they're discussing, Britain, you get this. Belgium, you get this. And one thing to really mention about this political comic is that this African guy is hiding behind the plant. There's no Africans here. This is white guys discussing what to do with an African, continent. And so that really portrays the racism that was happening, that they didn't even feel they deserved a voice in what would happen to their own continent. No, odds are there are no Americans here. America never really had much take in African imperialism. They did have Liberia. That it's kind of neat that if you look at Liberia's flag, it looks like the American flag, and that's because Liberia was essentially established to be a place to send back slaves after they were freed. It never really worked out, but some people did go back there. And now it's a country. So that's the Berlin Conference. It's really an important concept to know for Key Concept 5.2. especially with imperialism, African imperialism, especially because it talks about how Europe, just took over just all of Africa. It was a really important thing to know. All right. Here's a map of the British Empire. And something to note is that this isn't the British Empire and all of the land it ever owned. If you wanted to talk about all the land it ever owned, you could also talk about all of this up here. You could talk about some area up here at one point. They had spheres of influence over here. They owned all of this, all this. They were a monster of an empire. And, that's what they said. The sun never sets on the British Empire because it was literally never dark across the entire globe. We'll talk about spheres of influence in, I think, literally a slide or two. And then on the right, you have my man Cecil Rhodes, and this is a political comic called The Rhodes Colossus. And he was an entrepreneur who he became super rich off of his diamond expedition in Africa. And so he really he was a main proponent of African imperialism during this time. He's definitely a name to know, and you can tell. I mean, one thing to note is that when this is from, I believe, a British point of view, he is holding up Africa with his own bare hands. This guy is portrayed as not just a powerful guy, he's portrayed as a god. Cecil Rhodes. His name is Cecil Rhodes. He's pretty fat, meaning he's pretty rich. Is it important to know the imperialism of Canada? Not really explicitly. I feel like a lot of people think that you have to know the imperialism of a bunch of different places. You should probably know Africa, India. Those are the two biggest places you should know. Specifically in terms of what happens. You should know that they owned Canada, but you don't need to know the the story of how they took over Canada and then it became part of the Commonwealth and now it's kind of a weird spot. But yeah, you should, it's worth knowing. If you don't, it won't hurt you. All right, so I'm going to spend literally 30 seconds on this. Here is American Expansion and Manifest Destiny. So Manifest Destiny is kind of something that you could mention in an essay. It's not really needed, but it's basically where Americans thought that it was their God-given right to expand across from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And I'll show you a painting really at the end of this that really shows this idea. And so you have all the different ways that we got land. We have the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, in which we bought all of this land from France for $15 million. We have the Florida Cession. We have Andrew Jackson fighting Seminoles down here at one time. We have Texas's annexation. We have war. That's an important one to know. War causing imperialism. So we see the Mexican Cession, and this gives up all of this land from Mexico during the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Yeah, the Gadsden Purchase. That's a good purchase. Got to get that Southern Railroad in there. And then we have Oregon Country. So yeah, really, it's not super important to know American expansion, but you can it's definitely a good piece of evidence to know for a for an essay, for example. It's America's part of the world. All right, here I saw a couple of people asking about this. This is spheres of influence and Chinese imperialism. So during this time period, you really do see China just get demolished. They had some tries with the self-strengthening movement, but tied with China's already weak economy and their what is it called? And their very conservative Confucian government, change really wasn't happening all that often. And so what happens is Britain comes in and they're like, hey, I'd like to sell some opium. And China's like, okay, fine, we'll buy some opium. And then the entire population proceeds to just get addicted. And so they dump it all in the sea, try to get rid of it. And then Britain essentially throws a hissy fit and declares war on China. And because China is just ridiculously powered, they don't have any industrial power, they don't have any military power, really, they get destroyed. And so what happens is they sign the treaty of, what was it? I forget the name of the treaty, but they essentially signed this really unfair treaty. Nanking, thank you. They signed this really unfair treaty, and it gives the British areas in Hong Kong. We see down here, that's an important one to know. And then along here. And then eventually this really spirals into a bunch of different nations kind of grabbing different parts of China. We have the Japanese down here, the German. We have the French already down here established. We have the Russians kind of encroaching in. Manchurians start to come out. And this really all happens because China's just not really, they're they're not really in there. They're not really industrialized, and their self-strengthening movement really fails. And we see this culminate in the Boxer Rebellion, which I saw a couple of you guys mention, which is a really anti-imperialist, anti-European rebellion that took down the Qing dynasty. Essentially, it didn't technically. It ended in 1900, but after 1911, the dynastic system in China will die. Let me just add that as a question. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, drop them in the ask a question box. I'm going to start kind of trying to answer more questions and ask a question less in the chat, just because it kind of takes away from the presentation. All right, so here is some other stuff about technology and industrialization influencing imperialism. So on the left, we have, this was actually a document on the DBQ last year that I had to analyze. It was an easy one, but we see railroads being used to penetrate into Africa and to help imperialism really spread farther than it ever could. And so you see Britain do this primarily, and this really happens all the way down the country. So you can see all the way down here, you have this just kind of basically transcontinental railroad that is planned. And this really shows how, how it's built. And here we have the building of the Suez Canal, which is a really important example of, it's Tatooine. Basically, you see economic imperialism happen during this time period. And the Suez Canal is a really important example in which Britain kind of was trying to manipulate the geography of these continents in order to get the most profit. And that was a really important part of imperialism. All right, so some quick effects of imperialism. We have in India, the positives, and generally the positives for Africa and India are similar. We just have better technology, better medicine, better education, and stuff like that that really do help it a little bit. And in Africa, a small minority receive education and economic imperial opportunities. However, in India, it's more widespread. And you definitely see a lot of Indians get jobs in the British government to an extent, and they really do benefit a lot from British imperialism. However, there are obviously a lot of negative effects. So we see the top jobs going to the British, Indians feeling treated like inferiors. You can see that in the train DBQ as well. You see an erosion of traditional values and many social relationships. We see African people also being treated as inferior, so things like long hours for low pay. And then also there was when Europeans divided up Africa, and I feel like a lot of people forget this, when they divided up Africa, they were ignoring any sort of tribal, ethnic, cultural boundaries. And so they just kind of like went, all right, this bit, that's Britain, this bit, that's Belgium, this bit, you're France, you're Germany, you're a very good movie, stuff like that. And so they don't have any sort of way of thinking about it. They don't have any, and so this really causes tribal clashes to this day, even. And the final thing we're going to talk about is kind of less territorial imperialism and more economic imperialism. Do positives outweigh negatives? You could argue that, but it's an argument. I'd say there are many positive and negative effects. I'd say the negatives outweigh the positives, but that's up to you. All right, so we see economic imperialism happen here. So we see things like Dole and the Bananas Fruit Company really take over Latin America and and Hawaii. And what they start to do is essentially they build these almost empire-like companies that run countries. Remember, money makes the world go round. And so if you have a lot of money and you control an economy, you really control a country. And Dole's really well known for their for their pineapples, and United Fruit Company, and essentially Chiquita. If you look at many of your bananas at home, if you have bananas, you see that sticker on it a lot. Also, Julian, if you know that off the top of your head, it's top notch evidence. All right, so that's key concept 5.2. Again, I'll run through the questions and then see, and a lot of these I'll answer. These more general questions I'll answer at the end. All right. Can you go over the British Raj, Boer War, and Berlin Conference? The Boer War, I don't really know all that much about, I'll be perfectly honest. But the British Raj was essentially where, after the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857, after Indians revolted, Britain basically went, all right, we can't leave this alone anymore. We've got to send a bunch of resources, a bunch of reinforcements to Great Britain in order to keep control of these people. And so it really increases the amount of imperial control. And the Berlin Conference was basically where these European countries got together, and I'll actually go back to the slide of it. There it is. It's where all these European countries got together, and they decided, how are we going to chop up Africa so that we can use it to our best use? That's the primary thing. All right, let's see here. All right, what's the difference between social Darwinism and the white man's burden? They're very similar in nature. However, social Darwinism basically goes off of the idea that the Africans and other people are less evolved, whereas the white man's burden basically says it as the white people are, using the goodness in their hearts to help these poor, unevolved African people to reach, the glory of European civilization. And it's an inherently racist thing. These aren't, social Darwinism can be summed up in one word, pseudoscience. There's also some pseudoscientific things going on with people were saying that Africans had smaller brains or stuff like that. Talk about my favorite war. All right. So we're going to talk about we'll talk about the American Revolution a little bit, Kevin. So, I'll get there. All right. Was British imperialism in India more positive or negative? You can make the argument that it's both. It really depends on your point of view. For some Indians, it definitely helped them out. For if they were, a government official, it really was a positive for them. But for someone who was poor and who was really not having a great time, they weren't able to have the same opportunities. And whereas they did have some better technology, better education, stuff like that, you really, you don't really get that. Franco-Prussian War or First Sino-Japanese War, please. Fine, I'll drop that as a question. We'll go over it soon, Kevin. You don't have to boycott. All right. So let's start going over key concept 5.3, and there are 4. So this is going to go on for a little while. Whew, okay. So during this time period, you really do see a lot of revolutions, not just in the Atlantic revolutions, but you see all over the world. You see uprisings for social causes, for religious causes. And this really, you can consider this the easiest key concept, but that's really person to person. But the catalyst to this was really the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a new philosophical renaissance almost of thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, Locke, Montesquieu, and I'll go over those again. So I'll go one by one right now. So Voltaire, his main thing is religious tolerance. So he believes in freedom of religion, freedom of, to practice whatever you want. Rousseau, he believes in the social contract, where essentially how it works is you have your ruler and you have your citizen, right? These two entities. The ruler has to give the citizen rights, and the citizen, if the ruler is giving the citizen rights, has to give him loyalty. However, and here's the catch, if one of them breaks this contract, so for example, let's say the government stops giving rights to people, the people don't have to be loyal anymore. They can cut that off and now they can overthrow the government. And this really ties in with Locke's idea of natural rights. And so his ideas of life, liberty, and property really impact revolutions during this time period. Life, liberty, and property leads to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with such unalienable rights, such as the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's directly out of the Declaration of Independence. So you can really see how the Enlightenment really impacted these revolutions, because they provided the ideas and the kind of baseline for where these political ideas came in. You also see Montesquieu, who really impacts the development of the U.S. government. You have the 3 branches. Excuse me. And so there are 3 documents that you really should know quite well for this key concept, and those are the Declaration of Independence, the Dora-Mac, or Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and the Jamaica Letter, which really was it was a letter sent by Simon Bolivar that was essentially a letter. Yeah, I am flexing my A-push knowledge, Unit 5 gang. And so we see the Jamaica Letter be sent by Simon Bolivar that really helps to spur on these Latin American revolutions. And I can go more in depth into the causes of these revolutions. So the main ones that you really need to know for this class, the Marathon over the Mughals, I don't know why this is on here, ignore it. But you really need to know the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and the Latin American revolutions. And I'll go over those later, all in really, good detail. However, you also see, Rip Sitting Bull. So basically you see also slave rebellions. So the only one that's really super, effective is the Haitian Revolution. But you also see things like Nat Turner's Rebellion. You see, I don't know if Bacon's Rebellion wasn't slave rebellion, never mind. But you also see Bacon's Rebellion, which is important for APUSH. I'm sorry, I mean APUSH. These are the only rebellions I know. You also see things in the United States when you see things like, what was it called? What was his name? There's a guy who who stormed Potawatomi Creek and took over the Virginia armament with some slaves in a slave rebellion. That failed. And so you really see these slave revolts happen. You also see anti-imperialist ones, such as the Sepoy Rebellion, which was essentially where the British Empire said, we're going to start casing your bullets in cow fat in order to make it. It might have been a yes, James Brown. Thank you. I have homework on him this weekend. That's really sad. So you also see things like the Sepoy Rebellion. They say you have to coat your bullets in cow fat, and these Hindu Muslims, not Hindu Muslims. Wow, Hindu Muslims. This is not my week. You see these Hindu Indians say, we don't believe in using cows for our own personal good, so we're not going to do this. And so they rebel, and they, it fails. The Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 fails. You also see the Boxer Rebellion happen, which is a very high anti-imperialist thing. It's violent. It is gruesome. And it ends with a severely weakened Qing dynasty. And from 1900-ish to 1911, when it falls, it's not looking great for them. It's not, they're kind of just dead. They don't do much. And you also see some religious rebellions, such as the Ghost Dance and the Taiping Rebellion. Those are worth knowing. You also see some reforms in the Ottoman Empire and Chinese dynasties, like I've mentioned. You see the Tanzimat reforms, which attempted to bring industrialization to the Ottoman Empire. I forget what the Ghost Dance is. If there's anyone in here, a teacher or something who knows what the Ghost Dance is more in detail, do me a solid. But it was something with Native Americans, I believe, something like that. They danced something like that. They danced to scare white people. I don't really remember all that well. I'm sorry, but I could Google it later if you'd like. But really, you see the Tanzimat reforms come in, and they help to they really try to industrialize the Ottoman Empire, and this really helps to. They don't really. It's not super effective. However, it really shows that the Ottoman Empire was trying, and by 1914, however, 1918, they're gone. But it's more effective than the self-strengthening movement, which can really be summed up as just a giant failure. And so we see the self-strengthening movement. People basically their strategy is. And these are really spurred by a fear of imperialism. But we have essentially the Chinese, this is their logic here. They say, we're going to embrace the Europeans, take their technology, and then fight them out of our country. Yeah, it didn't work. It ended with a severely weakened Chinese government, a bureaucracy that was falling apart at the seams, and really just general bad. And you also see a global movement of isms. So, this time period can really be summed up in just the isms. So you have, liberalism, socialism, communism, feminism, republicanism, conservatism, just all of these isms. And they're really more important in AP Euro, but you should probably know some isms, such as feminism. Obviously, I think all of us are familiar with feminism here. Liberalism, again, kind of more compared to something like conservatism. Classical liberalism is more focused on a free market, but also some government involvement in things, and some more higher government involvement, and they're kind of more on the left, more socially conscious, stuff like that. Whereas conservatism is more keep things the same, keep the government out of here, stuff like that. You also see socialism and communism, which I won't really get into super deep, but it's kind of an idea where you try to take these two, as I mentioned before, you take the two class systems and you just kind of level them out. Okay. So these are the three documents that I mentioned. You have the Declaration of Independence, the Jamaica Letter, the Dora-Mac. And so these are three really foundational documents to the Age of Revolution during this time period. And you see these documents serve as Enlightenment documents that, help to spur other revolutions. Remember, the Declaration of Independence was then, kind of remade in the Dora-Mac, and then you see that right again in the Declaration of Sentiments in the Seneca Falls Convention, stuff like that. So that's really important, these three documents. You should know. And really, in your class, I feel like most teachers end up having you read them. You guys, drop in the chat if your teacher had you read the Declaration of Independence or the Dora-Mac, stuff like that. I think most teachers have you read it. Wow. Yeah, I'd give it a read, honestly. Do some, sit down for 15 minutes one day, do a little document analysis. At least some good fun, help you study. Fine, it'll be your fault when you don't understand it on the DBQ. All right, so we see these new social movements. So things like feminism and women's suffrage starts to rise during this time period. Abolitionism starts to rise. And I have no idea what the Russian thing is. I believe that might be the Russian Revolution. I'm really not sure. But you also see things like the temperance movement in the United States, which was an anti-alcohol movement. We see, What else do we see? We see a lot of, it isn't in this period, but I'm not really sure. We also see a lot of just general, movements for equality and movements for things like that. And while, they're, by 1900, women and African Americans and Africans in general weren't by no means equal. They were the first step. And I feel like a lot of people criticize these for, the world was still racist, and it was. But I think the good thing to mention is that they were still very extremely important and a really important step forward. I mean, you see in the United States, to flex some more APUSH knowledge, you see the fight for slavery go on from the 1840s to the, until the Civil War. And so you see all of these movements happen that really help it. And you see this across the world in general. You see this in Great Britain. And these are really spurred by the Enlightenment, when people start thinking, what makes a person a person? And they start thinking, well, is this African person? I'm not taking AP Euro. Don't worry. I can't take AP Euro. It's not offered at my school. All right. So here are the 4 revolutions, and this is going to take up the chunk. So the American Revolution here. If you thought I was flexing APUSH knowledge back there, here we go. So the American Revolution was really spurred by by what's it called? By unfair taxes, but also by the fact that they were being unfairly taxed, but they were being taxed with no representation. The whole idea of taxation without representation. And you see they revolt, and you have the Revolutionary War, and I can go in detail in this, but I know the Revolution stream happened a couple of weeks ago. You also see the French Revolution, which is after the American Revolution. You really see after the 7 Years' War, France is broke. But then in order to pay back, the government debts that they had, they say, all right, we'll take the poorest people and we'll tax them like crazy. And what happens is they start saying, well, then why aren't we given, a fair spot in the Estates General? Why aren't we, we're basically, we see them revolt. And this is a real class revolt. So when comparing the American and French revolutions, you can see the American Revolution was a fight for independence, where a French Revolution was a fight for liberty, a fight for class equality. And moving over to Haiti, which was actually a French colony at first, you see Toussaint Louverture. He rallies up these slaves in 1800 and 1803-ish, and he really just, they kill their white masters. And you can almost, if you're imagining it, you almost hear like metal music playing in the background. It's insane. And it works. It is the only successful slave revolt in world history. So that should really say something to you, in general. And so you see the Haitian Revolution happen. And so this really leads to an independent Haiti. And I believe, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Haiti actually had some rough years before they had more foreign involvement, because they kind of had to develop a new, government structure. Yeah, they really weren't doing great for the first couple of while, but then they got a hold of it. And then the Latin American revolutions, this one was the hardest for me to understand. How I understand is really, so you have to go back to period 4, and you have to go back to that social structure. Remember the Sociedad de Castas? So we have these Creoles. Remember, these are people born to 2 Spaniards, or Spanish people, but they're born in the Americas. And so what happens is they start saying, well, we've never really been to Spain. They're treating us unfairly, and we should be the general rulers of our own countries. Why do we need Spain? And you see Simón Bolivar rise up, and he's an important guy to know. There's really a guy for each of these. So, you see for this one, you have like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, a lot of guys. Here you have Robespierre, you have Lafayette. Those are really the 2 guys. Also Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Here we have Toussaint, Napoleon, I guess we could also talk about a little bit. And the Latin American revolutions, you have Simón Bolivar. So yeah, those are really the, there's a couple guys for each one. And so a little fun fact about the French Revolution, by the way. Marie Antoinette actually never said, let them eat cake. She actually said, let them eat brioche, which is like a squishy French sweetbread. So that's a little, fun fact. Add that to your LEQ. We also see feminism rise during this time period. And and so we see there are 2 main ones that you really want to know: Mary Wollstonecraft and Olympe de Gouges. And so Mary Wollstonecraft writes that, that if women be not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of virtue. So she's really calling for women education, and she writes a vindication of the rights of women. That's really important to know, that feminism starts rising. And you also see Olympe de Gouges, and she writes the the Déclaration de droit de la femme et de la citoyenne, which is basically the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen, and the woman. Wow, the rights of the woman and the citizen. And she writes that women are born and remain free and equal. All citizens, including women, are equally admissible to all. So she really calls for equality, and this is a really progressive idea, especially for 1791. And so that's really important to know. Guillotine, chop, chop. Essentially, yeah, French Revolution. All right, and then you also see the Seneca Falls Convention, which happens in 1848. And what happens is you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who's really important, a really important feminist in this time period. And she writes the Declaration of Sentiments, which is essentially a parody of the Declaration of Independence, which says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, and here's the twist, and women are created equal. And so that really caused some controversy. And this new feminine, this new idea of feminism really caused a shakeup in the social structure during this time period. All right, so the final thing in this key concept is nationalism. So really, I feel like this is kind of not talked about as much, but you see nationalism, and so the two I'm really going to talk about are Germany and Italy. The only reason I have Filipino and Argentinian is because I didn't want to cut off the word nationalism. Because, oh yeah, another ism. So the way nationalism really works during this time period is that you have people who have a common culture and a common heritage, and they come together and say, let's become one person, not one person, but one nation. You see the development of a nation state really come into fruition during this time period. And yeah, another thing that really brought together the Italians, that they, bled tomato sauce, we're eating pizza, all very Italian things. Don't write that down in your LQ. So yeah, but so the Germans, they really, so you see the German unification, and so you see prior to unification, you see that Germany was comprised of 300 individual states. You don't think about Germany being a very young state, but they're really a really young state. And so nationalism rose following the Napoleonic Wars and following the what was it called? In 1815, there was a thing that happened where the European countries came together and they decided, what are we going to do with Europe? And afterwards, Germany really became very unified and very, they became Congress of Vienna. Thank you. I'm really forgetting a lot of these terms. It's embarrassing. But you see this dream really be realized by Prussian Otto von Bismarck in 1871, and he's a really important figure in German unification. He's got a killer beard. He's got a killer mustache. He's a really important figure, and he really helps to bring together Germany. And on the topic of Prussia, there was also a war called the Franco-Prussian War, which I really don't know all that much about, but name drop. All right. You also see Italian unification, and so really you can see them calling for a third Rome during this time period. And so, we have the Roman Empire trying to come back for like an 85th time. It's 1800 at this point. So it's really kind of exciting to see the Third Rome happening. And it was based off the shared heritage of the Roman Empire and, Western civilization, which arguably the West was formed by the Roman Empire. And so they attempted unification a bunch of times, but Cavour and Garibaldi come in and succeed in 1871. All right, yeah, we got one more key concept. We're almost done. This one's quick. So, key concept 5.4, migrations. So the causes are things like population growth, improved transport. You also see a lot of famines and other things in Europe and other areas that push people over to the Americas and to other areas in the world. Yeah, I can explain migrations. It's really a broader topic, so you really don't need to know much about each specific migration, but it's important to know it's a real trend throughout world history that they're going to talk about on the exam. And so this, a lot of these migrations will really be name drops. You won't need to know the intrinsic, the little tiny bits about the Irish coming to the Americas. You'll just have to know the Irish came to America because of X. X happened, stuff like that. And so the outcomes of this are new gender things. So you have male migrants left, and you had women filling jobs. You see ethnic enclaves such as Chinatown and Little Italy, which we'll talk about. And then you see anti-immigrant policies such as the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which I should mention is part of the APUSH curriculum. All right. So here are some not necessarily political comics, but some little images about. So on the left you have the famine of I forget what year it is. I think it's 1848 actually, but you have the Irish famine, and the way this works is essentially after the Columbian Exchange, potatoes make their way over to Ireland and they just blow up, And so what happens is they start growing one type of potato, and that's it. And then in the 1840s, a bacteria comes in and just wipes it all out and just kills all of their food. And so people are starving. And yeah, it's because of monoculture. And the reason they really start growing only potatoes is, they're versatile, they're easy to grow, you can have them a bunch of different ways, they're starchy, high in calories. So it was a good plan until, all the potatoes died. And then you also see another push factor being German uprisings in 1848 and just general political instability in Europe in the late 1840s and early 1850s. The revolutions of 1848, unless you're an AP Euro, you really don't have to know all that much about, but they're worth, they're an interesting topic and they're worth looking into. And so you see during this time period a lot of in 1848, no, in 1848 it wasn't a country. They became a country in 1871. Okay, you don't need to know the date, but it's worth knowing. All right, so here's a map of all of the major migrations during this time period. You don't have to know all of them perfectly. I'd say the ones to know are the Irish to the Americas, Europeans in general to the Americas, the Chinese to Southeast Asia and to the Americas, and then the Indians to South Africa. So those are some really important ones. Unless you guys ask the questions about specific ones, I won't really go super in depth. But the main trend is that people are being pushed out of their country and being pulled to other areas. And it's a real main trend throughout world history. You have migrations really follow us. Excuse me. All right. So here's, a little thing. So a little pull factor. We have, the Statue of Liberty, and we have this idea of, the American dream. And this really pulls a lot of people to the Americas, especially during the 1800s. And yeah, that's Ellis Island. And so a lot of people come over kind of inspired to start a new life in the Americas. And so they come through Ellis Island. Specifically, a lot of people come to New York, which becomes a real, melting pot of places. However, on the other side, you have what's called nativism, which starts. And so here's two political comics about it happening specifically in the United States, but it happened kind of everywhere, but the Americas primarily. So that is the world melting pot political comic is from 1919. So we have things like Bolshevism, World War I, the mad notions of Europe being skimmed. You have the scum being skimmed off the top of this melting pot, and so it really shows American, American prejudice towards other ideas, and really American, they don't have much tolerance for anything. And then you also see this political comic about the Chinese, and so you see the Golden Gate of Liberty over here, and you have a Chinese guy, and you can tell he's Chinese not only because of the Q, but also because of some other features. And you can see it says, "Notice, communist, nihilist, socialist, Fenian, and hoodlum welcome, but no admittance to Chinamen." And so we really, that really poses a message in this political comic about how, how nativism really kept people out. And there were some really racist ideas that formed, not just about the Irish and the Chinese, but about any real foreign people coming in. There's, the idea of nativism is that our country is our people. We're Americans. Get out of our country, you Irish people. You Manchurian. You know what I mean? And so this really poses a specific. That's something you should really know, that imperialism was met with a lot of dislike. And you can even see this legally with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which I mentioned earlier, which literally kept out the Chinese from the United States. All right, final thing. When people did get into the United States, we have things called ethnic enclaves that form. So things like Chinatown, Little Italy. And so you see these things really happen because people of similar ethnicities kind of form their own little sectors and have their own and celebrate their own cultures. And so you have Chinatown, you have a big, Asian community, you have Little Italy, you have a big Italian community. There's also, I think I've seen Koreatown, there's a bunch. They're kind of all over the place. I know if you think like San Francisco, that's the second biggest Chinatown in the world. And so, yeah, these are really important things to know about migrations during this time period. All right, so final conclusion. This is a time grid, which is basically just everything that happened during this time period. And so you can really see, this is made by the actual god Framepedia. And so you can really see how things happen across time. So you can see things like the Ottoman Empire happening up here in the Middle East. But you also see the Suez Canal, the British Empire. You see the Manchu Empire, the Qing Dynasty, Taiping and Boxer Rebellion. You have the Berlin Conference, the Sepoy Rebellion. the American Empire. You see this whole thing, it really brings together the whole concept of time period 5, which is called industrialization and global integration. So really, you can really see that happening. Finally, here's a final map of the world in 1900. So you can see most of it is basically just empires. However, there are also, economic imperialism. There's a lot of religions. There's a lot of really things that are happening all over the place. And it's really important to understand these for the test. A lot of these are really, really big concepts they have to know. All right. So I'm going to quickly go through these art pieces. So this is called Liberty Leading the People. It's from the Second French Revolution in 1830, I want to say. And it really shows liberty, how people really in France, they believed in liberty leading the people, that liberty was the ultimate power and ultimate force that led to people getting rights back. And so you can see liberty leading the people to to take over the monarchy and to really get their own liberty back. All right. This is the wave, it's called. And so it's an example of Japanese woodblock painting and Japanese art. It's a really famous painting. And it's of I forget what it's of, but it's a really important painting that you should at least be able to recognize. And it's a woodblock painting, yeah. So it's a new style of art. All right, this is the one I want to show you. This is called American Progress. And this is basically, this is almost a political comic in a way, that you have manifest destiny, essentially, yep. And you have this angel, it almost looks like the Statue of Liberty coming in, and you have all these Western people coming to the West. You have these trains, you got wagon trails. However, you also see Native Americans running away. So this really goes to show the double nature of imperialism, where you have the white people coming in to establish new economic opportunities, but then you're also at what cost, All right, we have Starry Night, which is a piece of European Impressionist art. And it's really an interesting story. I believe I remember reading somewhere that Van Gogh painted this from an insane asylum, I believe. And Van Gogh, out of itself, is a really interesting artist. That if you like interesting people, he's really cool. And finally, this is a photograph that was taken. Finally got photos, and it's really sad. Kind of makes me depressed every time I see it. But it's of a city. And cities really during this time period were really disgusting. They were crowded. There was really nothing good about them. And so what you see is these little children. They're unsanitary. Yep, they're dusty, smoggy, and you see these little children huddled in this alleyway, just trying to sleep, trying to stay warm. And it really is a sad photo, but it really does show what was going on during this time period, the positives and the negative effects of imperialism. And it's really an important one to know that, when people started urbanizing, it happened so quickly that we really didn't know what to do. And so, what happened was we had these really huge, crowded, unsanitary cities. And a really good example is London. If you've ever watched the movie The Elephant Man, you really get a good look at London in this time period. It's disgusting. It is under Slides and Resources. If you click on it, it brings you to a Google Drive folder. Here, I'll stop sharing my screen so I can show you here where it is. Where is it? Because now we're done with the. There we go. Share. All right. So basically, yeah, if you click on it, it brings you to here. You have notes that I wrote last year on this. It's essentially just the slides rewritten down, but also some little things that I might have forgotten to mention. Other things that are in there. It's just nice to know. Then you have the slides in here. And then you have I believe it's 16 pages long. There's a giant study guide of all of the content that we've gone over tonight. So there we go. All right, so that was really time period 5. Now I'm going to go through all the questions. And if you guys have any things to talk about, feel free to chat about it. But I'm going to start going through. And also, now is probably a good time to mention that you should probably go through the questions and upvote what you, what you like or what you dislike. So upvote what you like, and I'll answer them in the order that they're upvoted. All right, so what is the true separation between period 5 and period 6? This is a really good question. I really like this question. And really, to know when the actual split is, the literal date is 1900, but I would honestly say like the turning point, it could be considered 1899 with the Boxer Rebellion. It can be considered 1914. It used to be 1914 with the World War I. There's a lot of turning points in the first, and last centuries of the 19th and 20th centuries. And it's a really good question. And that's kind of the point of AP World, to have you asking questions, not just what happened in 1877 in Massachusetts and blah, 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 blah. No, what's really important to know is, what analyzing the history, having it be a story, as opposed to having it be a very split up, very, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's a really good question. I really, 10 out of 10. And so, yeah, I mean, I'd say maybe, I'd say 1900 would be a good one. More, it's just because the 20th century is really a beast unto its own. But I would say 1914 as well. I don't really like U.S. history. I'm in it right now, and so it's all my examples. I can give specific examples for if you give me a location, I could. It's just that a lot of them are from APUSH. So yeah, sorry if I'm mentioning U.S. history a lot. It's just I know the examples from U.S. history most well, best. All right. Could you explain the different philosophies of industry, socialism versus communism versus capitalism? And so socialism versus communism, I'm really not sure of. Communism, I feel like, is just a more radical form of socialism. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But socialism and communism both share the idea that you want to equalize the wealth gap and really bring together. You did explain? Okay. So yeah, if you scroll down, you see that. And then capitalism is based on private property and private investment. It's almost the opposite of socialism and communism. All right. How does period 5 end? Well, it ends in 1900. You have a world where Europe is the dominant force. We have them taking over almost the entire world, and we have a real new global system. So, think about it in 1750, and this is another type of AP, really good AP world question. In 1750, you have this world that is starting to get industrialized. We have these new social structures, these new maritime empires. And then in 1750, things change in the sense that we zoom off into industrialization, imperialism, revolutions. It's a really jam-packed era. For 150 years, it's insane. And then by 1900, we have this new global system where we have migrations, we have trains, we have new sources of trade and new sources of really the way the world interacts with each other is completely different. Technology really impacts the way we communicate through Morse code, through other things like that. And that's a really good question. How do you source a document? I'm assuming you mean in terms of the DBQ point of view point. My teacher taught me a thing called CHIPO, which essentially, I know a lot of you guys learn HIP. CHIPO is essentially just an analysis tool. It's basically content, historical context, intended audience, point of view, purpose, and outside information. And if you use CHIPO for each of your documents during a DBQ, you'll be perfect for analyzing your documents. Right, this one, I'll just do that because someone already answered it. Right. How did Africa react to European imperialism? There were a lot of different reactions. So I was mentioning things fall apart as a specific example, but you see some people kind of embrace it and they convert to Christianity, and they're the ones who really become more successful in the society. But then you see some people resist it, and you see them really have a hard time fitting in with the society, and they didn't really have a choice. And so a lot of people die because they don't convert to Catholicism, or they fight the system and they get shot and they get killed or they get hung. This really is a really important thing to note, that there was no choice for the Africans. They didn't say, oh, you're imperializing us, we'd really rather not. And then Britain went, oh, excuse me, I'll back off. No. That's not how it worked. It was, Africa was like, we really would rather you not. And then Britain was like, let's look at these savages trying to talk to us. It was kind of more like that. Could you explain some key details in the revolutions? The key details for all of the revolutions are kind of murky. Of the Enlightenment, the idea of kind of more rights for people, stuff like that. In terms of the French Revolution was really about liberty and economic things like that. And then you see them kind of trying to find their freedom back. It's really an interesting revolution because after then you have Napoleon rise, and then there's that whole other revolution. But it's really about the common man, the third estate, rising up against these political and economic elites to form a more equal society. And it really gets very radical very quickly. And I know if you're an AP Euro, you know that a lot more in detail. And technically the French Revolution isn't in the curriculum anymore, but it's still worth knowing because it's good evidence. That one's already been answered. Why wasn't China industrialized? All right, so this kind of goes back to period 4. So in period 4, we start to see China have its decline, especially with more European involvement. And after they start shutting down foreign trade, they have Zheng He, who they burned down his ships in 1433. And then in this time period, we really see them just keep going down. They have a very conservative government who wants to keep things the same. And so they really don't believe in industrialization. And so you also see China had restricted Western influence. And it was ended after the Treaty of Nanking, but by then, Europe had gotten so weak, China had gotten so weak that it was kind of a lost cause for them. Whew. Okay, 2 more questions. Explain feminism. Feminism, at least in this time period, is the rise up of women for socioeconomic and political equality to men. And really, obviously it didn't happen by 1900, but it was the start. And it was a really important start because what you have is you have a foundation for first wave feminism in the early 1900s, 1920s. And this really brings in a ground base for feminism across the globe. And then in the 1960s, you see second wave feminism, and now we're seeing third wave feminism, more around, reproductive rights and personal rights. And so we really can see this chain of events with feminism during the time period. It's a really important movement to know. All right. So that looks like all the questions. Oh, never mind. What is imperialism? Imperialism it's really a broad term, but it's extending a nation's power by taking control of another nation. Stella, that's a really nice definition. But it's essentially where another country takes over another country. And the new imperialism that you see in the 18 and 1900s is really distinct in the sense that it's full takeover as opposed to like economic imperialism or something like that. All right, looks like that's kind of clears it out for tonight. Does anyone else have any other questions? I'll stick around for a little while longer. If you guys, there we go. We're getting them. Yeah, my dog's crazy, so if you guys hear her bark, sorry. All right. What is nationalism? Nationalism is basically where you have people of a common heritage and of a common culture, common language, common religion come together and say, instead of being 8,000 different states, we're going to be one nation state, one single country. And this happens specifically in Germany and Italy. So it's really people just unionizing under one or two or a couple of specific features and nationalities. Can you talk about how DBQs work and how to cite evidence? Yeah, sure, totally. So the way DBQs work is essentially, and I have a slideshow for this, so I should probably pull this up. I was going to do a DBQ slide, but then it never worked out. All right, there it is. So here, I'll pull up my screen. There we go. Let me just close it and open it back up so I can focus on the chat while I'm doing this. There we go. I won't go through this whole presentation, but really what you want to do when you're reading the documents and using them is it's a very similar format to the to the LEQ in the sense that it's the same sort of general format. And so we see it's similar to an LEQ. You want to use the documents as your evidence like you would an LEQ, and you want to explain how they proved your thesis. So you don't want to directly quote, but what you want to do is you want to use the evidence found in the documents to prove your thesis. And a really good way to get these points is use phrases like this shows and this illustrates or this exemplifies, and so it really forces you to explain what the document's saying. And you want to really be clear in your writing. So it's really okay to be very blunt in your writing. You could say that, but really you could also, I feel like it's more effective to, instead of saying document 4, you can say, this excerpt from the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen, or, stuff like that. And really, readers only spend around 2 minutes reading an essay. So you don't want to make them search for the points. You want to make them, you want it to be a very concise, very consistent thing where it's, evidence, explanation, document analysis, analysis. And so it's really okay to be very blunt with your writing. This isn't an English paper. And you really at least try to use 6 documents. I feel like a lot of people always get scared and they only use 2 or 3 documents. That's not a good thing. Use at least 6. And if you don't get the points, okay, but you're giving yourself the chance to earn those points. Because the way the AP exam works is you start at 0 points and you go all the way up. There's no, you start at 130, you lost a point here, lost a point here. You can only gain points. And so you can't lose points once you get them. So that's really the big point with DBQs. Yeah, it's 20% of the exam, I believe. I can look at this. Did I put that on here? I didn't put that on here. Wow, okay. So, yeah, here we are. All right, let's see. What breed is your dog? What is your dog's name? These are the most pressing questions of the night. She's a pit bull boxer, and her name's Ruby. So she's crazy. Very cool. So that kind of... also, I wanted to mention, if you're requesting access to the folder, and it's not working out, what you want to do is you're on a school account, and so go into a personal account and then and use it because your school blocks outside emails. Also, they do give you documents. Might as well use all 7. Exactly, Kevin. That's a perfect point. Use all 7. If you use one wrong, that's fine. They'll say, okay, you don't earn a point for this. However, if you used it right, you got the point. It's perfect. All right, any other questions? Period 5, even other material. Period 6, even I can talk about a little bit. Other skills in the exam, stuff like that. Yeah, you want to be fast, but really, I mean, it's an hour to write an essay, so it's more than enough because these aren't supposed to be long, PhD dissertations. They give you more than enough space and more than enough time to write these essays if you know how to budget your time. All right, any other questions or comments, concerns regarding? There's never enough time or space, really, for real. I mean, there really is. If you learn how to budget your time, it's easy. Yeah, honestly, with the amount of more than one evidence per paragraph. Have like 2 or 3 per paragraph, especially in an LEQ. But yeah, with an LEQ, if you get really good at them, like I know I was really good at them by the end of last year, and I was able to write them in like a 30 minute time frame. And also, when in doubt, if you don't know a piece of evidence, if you don't know it's right, write it down anyway because you can't lose points. In fact, I feel like I've said this on here before, but I'm about to blow away all my flexes tonight. On my exam, we had the essay on the effects of the Columbian Exchange, right? I proceeded to write, squeeze between my death of 90% of the population and my slavery paragraph. I wrote about how because of more food, the Native American population rose. And so, not my finest moment, but I wrote it down anyway because I knew that I wouldn't lose points because of it. And so it didn't lose many points, and I still got the 5. So, if I can write that the Columbian Exchange increased Native population, I'm still get a 5, you can get a 5 as well. Any other questions or topics you want me to talk about? I feel like I'll forget everything right before the exam. That's a really valid fear. But if you're confident in yourself, if you study hard for the next month and a half or 2 months, and you go into that exam knowing I've been preparing for this for the past month and a half, you go in there, remembering that you know your information. You can tell yourself, I've studied for this, I'm confident, and I know what I'm doing. And it's okay to be stressed out. Stressing out means you care. And I mean, the stress is normal, and I'm here for you guys. If you guys literally ever need help, hit me up on Instagram, Discord, Twitter, not really Twitter, but Snapchat, all those things. And I'm really willing to work through things with you guys personally if you guys want me to, or, I'm here for all y'all, So, if you know me in real life too, hit me up. Can I talk about the complex political strife of the Roman Empire during 235 to 284? No, that's not covered in the WAP curriculum. I can't solve a Rubik's Cube either. Unfortunate, but true. I don't even have a Rubik's Cube. Anyway, I think if there aren't any more questions, I might end it here. I know Jillian dropped my Instagram above, but I'll drop it again. That's my Instagram, and then this is the only reason I do these slides for for blatant promotions. Yeah, shameless flex. Yeah, you can just paraphrase, right? Yeah, you can paraphrase. Also, I want to make sure you guys know I'm not trying to flex on you guys. I'm just trying to, I'm really here for you guys. If it wasn't for you guys, I wouldn't be teaching you guys. So really, y'all are the winners. That's what all flexers say. You know what? I put my AirPods in one at a time, like all you other guys. All right. So, I think if there are no more questions, I think I'm going to end it there. Yeah, I think I'm going to end it there. So, yeah, Kevin, you're not a loser. Oh, we got a question. Do you have any sources or slides for period 4? I do. I will grab them and drop them right now. They're from the period 4 slide, that session that I did probably about a month ago. So here you go. Those are period 4. It has in there, let me look. In there it has the notes, an outline, the study guides, and the slides. So yeah, kind of the same thing that we did tonight. When am I hosting book review? Oh man, I'll have to talk to Amanda about that. I'm totally hosting book review. I'll go through all the review books with you guys. I will, right then. If you guys want me to actually do review book review, I'll totally do that with you guys. Am I streaming again next week? I hope I am. If Amanda's in here, This is me asking, can I host next week? But I hope I am. But I don't. Odds are probably it'll end up being Mr. Lassiter or Amanda. I kind of do more special things and more reviews than I do like normal content stream. But you know, if I could, I would. All right, so that looks to be the end of it. I'll totally do a meme review. Yeah, AP World meme review. Yes. All right. So yeah, I'm gonna end it here. So have everyone, you know, have a good night. You know, good luck. Talk to you guys, you know, next time I see you.